Chapter 15. G. Dong Jin Ji and his team returned to the storage facility and waited for word from the men sent to investigate his two boats and their keepers. When the radio call came in, Ji's chest tightened at the news of both boats' destruction, blood everywhere, and two missing members of his elite team. While the recon team made their way back to the storage facility, Ji lamented his position on the battlefield. He had wanted to bring more men, but was overruled by superiors who felt a show of force would weaken their humanitarian aid narrative. The Chinese and Korean planners of the invasion were approaching the American people in much the same way their own government did. America, China, and North Korea were at odds. That was true, but Korea and the Chinese would explain to the American people that though their government didn't want help, America was simply too big a player in the world to be allowed to fold. If America fell, the world would be thrust into chaos, sucked into the vacuum created by the absence of the most powerful country to ever exist on planet Earth. The U.S. government had said and done the same thing after the 2008 market crash, buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of toxic assets, and then purchasing nearly $250 billion in shares from businesses like Bank of America and Citigroup. A similar event had happened back in 1792, when the Treasury Secretary at the time, Alexander Hamilton, authorized the purchase of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stock in an attempt to offset the credit crunch that was occurring at the time. Their initial plan hinged on using the same proven tactics against an American people who had become accepting of such illogical absurdities. Even G chuckled when the plan was explained to him. The Americans were by far the most gullible group of human beings he'd ever pitted himself against. When a company used bad business practices and got themselves into trouble in America, all they were required to do was lobby the government for money under the pretense that they were too important to fail. As long as that company had the capital and the support from a few politicians they'd bought over the years, they'd be saved. That was a tactic built into every large business in America, and had been for generations. The government would then prop up the poorly run companies using taxpayer dollars and tell the people it was for their own good. G knew it was actually much more complicated and corrupt than that, but to the average man or woman on the street, it was quite that simple. Pay, or the banks will fail, and the country will collapse. Fear bred obedience. G was no stranger to that ideology. If G could strike fear in the people the same way their own corporate-run government was able to do, his operation would be successful. He would use the same tactics America employed on her people. Create a problem, and then present a frightened society with the means to solve said problem. The key to any successful societal control campaign didn't stop there, though. The American elite, along with elected officials, had worked feverishly to divide the country based on political beliefs and a myriad of other social factors, and G would do the same. That division was injected into American society through the media, including social media, and came in nearly every form a man, woman, or child could imagine. If it could be debated, the powers of division were hard at work, stoking the flames of dissent on both sides of the issue. His mind raced over all he'd done and all he still needed to do as he sat in the manager's office, a tiny square box with a desk and a single chair. G smiled to himself at the thought of the great gift the American government and their masters had given his country, making his part of America's undoing all that much easier. The gift came in the form of absolute intolerance across the board. The division was there, and debates had taken place daily, both in person and on social media platforms. The real power came only after men and women on opposing sides of social subject matters had been conditioned to be outraged at the differing opinions which fed the engines driving the bifurcation machine through their own government's Machiavellian rule. It would be like stealing an already trained monkey. G and his people were going to use that conditioned state of Western society to turn Americans on their own government, then offer them the solution to their problem in the way of food, clean water, and medical aid. The result? The American government would find itself fighting a war on multiple fronts with varying degrees of complexity. China and Korea's greatest fear was the American patriot and their ability to turn the tide of anything they involved themselves in. Assuming China's war planners were spot on, that asset would turn on their own government, and before anyone in America's currently twisted civilization realized it, they would all be under the rule of China and North Korea. Again, he laughed to himself at the thought of how much help his enemy had given him in her undoing. When the radio squelched and he heard his team of 6 coming through, along with the passwords that meant everything was clear, G got to his feet and walked out to meet them. The men were wet, muddy, stunk of stagnant waters, and looked exhausted as they moved into the building. Chun Hee Tak, the leader of the 6-man team, and second in command should G fall in battle, looked grim. G and Tak's eyes met briefly before G turned and re-entered his office. Tak followed his superior officer inside and closed the door. G was seated, staring expectantly as his junior officer looked around awkwardly for a second chair, but found none. "It seems we have a problem, sir," Tak began. G stared impassively at him, knowing the essence of what Tak was about to say and already considering his options. Tak would add some details, but it was unlikely any informational minutiae of the incident would change G's overall understanding of what had happened. "We are not dealing with some local rancher. Whoever did this had to move across a vast area of flat wetlands. It would have taken great discipline to remain hidden. Additionally, not many rounds were fired, maybe 20 at most, and both our men were hit based on 2 separate blood trails near the boats. Every piece of useful gear was either taken or tossed in the water, and the 2 bodies were removed from the ambush site," Tak said. G nodded his head slowly, looking down at his hands. He was only 34 years old, but right now, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he felt 50 years older. "This ambush, whether local or professional, changes nothing. Men die in battle. That is the way of the warrior, and we must continue to move forward." "Yes, sir," Tak said, bowing his head ever so slightly. "When do we next meet the town's leadership?" "Tomorrow morning. Our troops have landed, Tak. We are on the precipice of a great victory. Our grandchildren will sing songs about the Supreme Leader's great triumph over the mighty America." He leaned forward, his eyes shining, seeming to light the room with their gleam. "Tak, they will be here in just 2 days. G had received word earlier in the day via his radio operator and knew Portland now had Korean troops on her soil. The invasion had met no resistance, and the report indicated the convoy of APCs were already rolling south on both highways. 2 years prior, the Chinese and North Korean governments had begun siphoning military vehicles from their ranks and storing them inside cargo containers. Nothing on a large scale, and no more than 2 vehicles were removed from any unit at a time. The containers would sit for months inside a warehouse before being repainted and moved to another storage facility. Some of the containers were placed on ships and moved around the world, never brought to port, but moving constantly. The intentions of the Chinese and North Koreans was to make it impossible for Western intelligence networks to discover armored vehicles were being secreted, and second, if they did suspect something, make it difficult to account for any of the missing vehicles. Over the past 6 months, all the missing armored vehicles were loaded on commercial freighters where they sat waiting to be delivered to the shores of the Americas. That was not a difficult feat, since most of what America bought and used across the board came from China. Fleets of container ships were on a permanent rotation between America and Chinese ports 365 days a year. North Korea had gone so far as to move containers with the vehicles to the southern border in a show of force against South Korea, only to move empty containers away again in a show of de-escalation. In order to trick the CIA's prying eyes, the North Koreans manipulated the shocks on the trucks used to move the empty containers. After leaving the armored vehicles and staging locations, they replaced them with much weaker suspension parts that would sag under the relatively light outgoing load, making the haulers appear laden with the same weight they'd arrived with. The Chinese conducted similar operations, and before long, both countries had created a fairly large vehicle fleet that was wholly unaccounted for by Western intelligence. China's war planners believed strongly that America would expect a West Coast invasion to occur in or around San Diego. With a mostly crippled power grid, the Americans would find it difficult to respond to strategic missile strikes on key military and civilian infrastructure targets. San Diego's naval shipyards would be pummeled as Chinese and North Korean ships approached, transitioning through international waters into U.S. waters, bypassing all U.S. maritime limits and boundaries. When the U.S. Navy responded, there would be a fight. China knew that was an inevitable hardship they'd be forced to overcome. America's submarine force had been taken into account, but China's answer to that was to overwhelm the relatively small number of underwater craft the United States had, not to mention the fact that most weren't lurking in the waters off of America's coast. They were more likely positioned off the coasts of unfriendly countries, where they would remain awaiting orders during these most confusing and ambiguous times. G was by no means a war planner, but he was a student of war. He would not kid himself when it came to the capabilities of the Americans. Korea was in for a fight the likes of which they hadn't endured since the 1950s. The electromagnetic pulse weapons detonated above would not neuter America's Navy. Those ships near the blast radius would suffer some systems damage, but naval ships already emitted so many types of energy waves on their own, they'd been hardened to a certain degree against an EMP by virtue of being protected against themselves. As the war raged off the coast of Southern California, G's comrades would be steaming for Portland, Oregon. Once they arrived, they would slip into the Columbia River before making their way to predetermined docks for a speedy offload. Other ships would remain at sea, unloading cargo containers filled with helicopters and equipment needed to establish their supply lines along the coast. Once assembled, the helicopters would transport teams of men along with refueling and supply equipment to pre-planned positions along Highways 5 and 101. The ZBL-09 vehicles would then begin their movement to the south. The ZBL-09 was unique in that it could be configured as a troop-carrying assault vehicle, a self-propelled artillery piece, and even a bridge lane engineer vehicle. The ZBL-09 was also easily adapted into a recovery vehicle with the addition of a crane for pulling stuck or destroyed vehicles out of the convoy's path. This capability would help immensely in clearing the stranded vehicles along their route. All configurations would be used during the occupation, but still, he worried about one thing that could bring the great convoy to a grinding halt: a failed supply line. It was up to his and other teams like his to make sure the surviving American citizens did not become an obstacle. After the Bayet brothers slithered away to follow the North Korean soldiers, Mike pulled his reduced team in tighter. Since they had a terrific view in every direction for over 500 yards, he wasn't worried about the risk of a single grenade taking them all out. Alex scooted closer to Mike, and the Green Beret could sense the cop wanted to talk. "What?" Mike snapped gruffly. "Why'd you send those clowns?" He gave Alex a sidelong look that told the cop Mike might very well think he was the clown for asking that question. "You don't like them, do you?" "They're both shitbags, man." Alex shrugged, as if that was somehow a foregone conclusion Mike should have known. "They robbing banks, hurting people, shit like that?" Mike asked, scratching at his ear. "No, nothing like that. They were always poaching, and I'm pretty sure they both had some guns that are illegal in California." Mike chuckled softly before responding. "I'm going to guess you never caught them doing either." "I never arrested them, but we had informants. I'm pretty sure they were doing shady stuff all the time. Changing reg numbers on boats, poaching, probably smoking weed. I mean, Before it was legal, he added, hoping to bolster his case. Mike snorted. Look at it this way, Alex. 2 dudes go to work. One is a cop, and one is, well, slightly askew from the lines of the law. You tracking? Alex gave a quick nod as Manny leaned in, eavesdropping on the conversation. One of the dude's job is to live his life however the hell he wants, while the other dude's job is to arrest him for it. At the end of the day, if the first dude isn't in jail, the second dude isn't doing his job. Alex grimaced. That's a stupid way to look at it. I was handcuffed by the Constitution. They get to do whatever they want. That's where you're dead wrong, amigo. Mike pointed a dirty finger at him. First off, excuses make you less of a man. And second, the dude I'm referring to here, not you, has it much tougher than you. You get to go home and sleep without worrying if someone is going to kick in your door. Want to trade places with them? Not waiting for an answer, he pushed on. You both have obstacles, yours being the Constitution and theirs being you. Alex shook his head in a disagreement. Not even the same. Mike studied the cop for a moment, then decided to speak Marine to the man, and maybe then he'd get it. Well, I guess we can agree to disagree, but have you ever heard of a dude named Pappy Boynton? Of course. Mike fostered no doubt Alex would know who Pappy was. After all, the Marine Corps reprogrammed young recruits with more history lessons on the illustrious past exploits of their sacred corps than any other 2 services combined. Pappy was part of a squadron named Black Sheep, right? Yeah. Pappy was a damn criminal, Alex, but his talents during wartime were so prolific the military pretty much overlooked all the drinking and fighting and whatever else he got himself into. What I'm saying is leave that drama from your past behind. We're in big trouble as a nation, and we all need to embrace anything and anyone who can add to what we're trying to achieve. Alex turned away, staring out across the swampy wetlands towards the slough. They ain't no Pappy, but let's see how they do this time around. Fair enough, Mike conceded. 3 hours after the brothers left to follow the North Korean soldiers, Mike and what remained of his team got to their feet and made their way west toward the highway. The Green Berets exerted extra caution, knowing there were people out there who'd shoot first and never ask questions if they spotted 4 kitted-up guys moving surreptitiously through the area. When they arrived at the warehouse, they found the brothers waiting impatiently. What took you so long? Rostam fired at them the moment they came through the doors. Mike ignored the question. You find out where they're laying their heads? Yeah, and we're lucky we didn't run into them on the way out there. It's a storage place right next to the highway, a little south of town. The roar of a jet engine overhead stopped their conversation as every person inside the warehouse rushed to a window or door. The Green Berets rushed to a side door and stared into the skies above as a second jet shot overhead, transitioning from east to west. Before either jet was out of sight, their pilots yanked the noses of their aircraft skyward, gaining altitude. Then both aircraft banked hard, moving away from one another. Mike could hear the engines working hard as the pilots put the fighters into hard G-turns while pushing the throttles into what sounded to him like afterburner mode. Mike was no pilot, nor was he an expert on U.S. or other military aircraft, but even he knew what he saw was not normal straight and level flight. Within seconds, both jets were nothing more than tiny specks in the heavens, the roar of their engines a far greater presence than the aircraft's visual imprint on the blue sky. Mike squinted at first, and then shaded his eyes as 2 thin lines of smoke trailed the speeding fighters. Bro, they've got incoming, Mike said in a hushed tone. Tim pulled out his binoculars and tried to lock on the elusive fighters far above him. I think those are ours, a couple of F-18s, but I can't be sure. 4 additional specks appeared from the west, swiftly closing in on the 2 original fighters. The engines of all 6 aircraft reverberated off the hills as the pilots throttled up and then down, maneuvering the aircraft this way and that. It was all confusing to watch from the ground, 30 or 40,000 feet below where the action was taking place. 10 seconds into the aerial display, Mike couldn't tell which aircraft were the original two and which were the new arrivals from the west. Having never seen aircraft in actual combat, Mike's only reference points were films, like Top Gun and Iron Eagle, where the viewer saw the fighting sequences from a completely different and much less detached view than what he was experiencing. A bright flash signaled that one of the pilots would either be dead or on foot. Mike watched as one of the tiny specks tumbled from the sky, trailing thick, black smoke. "I think that's one of our guys, Mikey," Tim gulped, his voice filled with trepidation as he struggled to track the stricken angel. "You see a chute?" Mike asked, wondering what they'd do if a chute did appear. If it were an American pilot, they'd want to get the guy to a safe area and have him picked up so he could fly again. If a chute opened and belonged to a foreign invader, Mike was of the opinion he'd kill the guy, no matter the circumstances. Fighting for one's homeland held slightly altered rules of engagement in his mind. No quarter could be offered to hostile men in a man's homeland. The intent should be to kill them all or kill enough of them that the rest lost the stomach that was required to occupy America. That tactic was proven, and American fighting men should know best after Korea, Vietnam, and more recently Iraq and Afghanistan. "No," Tim finally muttered as the burning plane disappeared behind the mountains to the west. Still staring into the sky as the remaining 5 aircraft continued their deadly dance overhead, Mike spotted a second flash, and then again, smoke streamed from another afflicted aircraft. "One of ours?" he asked apprehensively. "I can't tell." The roar of the jets overhead continued, which told both Green Berets the remaining American pilot had somehow scored a hit, even in the midst of overwhelming odds. Both men silently rooted for their man high above, fighting for his life against more than 2-to-1 odds. The pilot was fighting for more than his life. He was fighting for his home, and it showed in his ability to nab one of the bastards who'd killed what would have been a close friend. The man in the cockpit was likely terrified, only able to react with cunning and well-honed skills because of the rigors of his training. Just like any fight, both Green Berets knew the man would fatigue, and that would lead to his undoing. He was working twice as hard as the men trying to kill him, surviving on adrenaline and perhaps a little need for revenge before they overwhelmed him. "Get another one," Mike whispered under his breath, hearing the roar of thousands of pounds of thrust above him crashing against an indifferent sky. As if in answer, another much larger flash engulfed one of the aircraft, yellow flames dragging off the back of both wings as it nosed over and rocketed towards Earth. Neither Green Beret commented, waiting to see if the engine noise dropped off. When it didn't, Mike pumped a fist close to his chest like a quarterback who'd just tossed a touchdown. "Give 'em hell, brother." Tim dropped the binoculars and squinted skyward, trying to find the cluster of warplanes with his naked eye. "I think our boys got 2 so far." "2 to go," Mike muttered. "I think the bad guys are bugging out," Tim exclaimed. Mike noted a change in the sound of the jet's engines as 2 of the specks dove lower and then retreated to the west. The sole remaining plane dove, its engine screaming to the point Mike expected to hear something break before the pilot pulled up. The pilot leveled the craft at what seemed like 10 feet above the tops of the mountains as the aircraft closed with the Green Berets' position. The pilot was running afterburners and traveling at speeds Mike found difficult to track. The jet passed overhead to the north, flying over the city of Petaluma in less than a second before disappearing to the east, its dissipating engine noise the only evidence it had been there. Tim placed his binoculars in his pack and turned, heading for the warehouse doors. "I'm going to report this." Mike grunted his approval and followed his partner inside. He needed the Bayettes to map out exactly where the North Koreans were holed up, and then he and Tim could start planning how to rid the area of them. He wasn't about to take a bunch of civilians on a building assault, even if 2 were former Marines and cops. There was a huge difference between some tweaker holed up in his mom's trailer and a dozen well-trained Special Forces soldiers. Whatever the plan, it would have to be tailored around surprise, speed, and violence of action. There was no other way to overcome them unless Mike could get 100 men and was okay with a 25% attrition rate, which he wasn't. Mike spotted the two brothers, who were never far from one another, and raised a hand. "Hey, fellas, we need to talk." He led them to the break room in the back of the warehouse. Inside was a large rectangle table surrounded by cheap but useful plastic shell chairs. A built-in counter lined one wall, atop which sat several now useless items such as a microwave and toaster. A television hung on the far wall, its black screen staring at the room like the rectangle eye of a giant shark. Mike spread out the city map, choosing a more civilian navigational aid so the brothers would better point out the North Koreans' position. Before he flattened the edges of the map, Rostam stabbed a finger at a point on the map just south of town. "Right there. They're all in there, and they have guys keeping watch on the outside." "How many on the outside?" Mike asked. Rostam squinted at the map, his brow knitted in consternation. He rocked his head from side to side, then glanced at Darian for help. Darian's face remained placid as he answered. "I saw 4. 2 by the main gate and 2 by the smaller gate near the office. The guys from the boats went into the office, so I think that's where they're mostly at. The office accesses the rest of the storage spaces without having to go outside." "What's the fence or gate made out of, and how tall is it?" Mike probed, not expecting much from the untrained brothers. Apparently, not wanting to be upstaged by his older but smaller brother, Rostam responded, "Probably 8 feet, and it's metal, like wrought iron." Mike hid his mild surprise and hauled out a topographical map, laying it next to the city map. He examined the contour lines showing elevations across the map and saw there was an area across the highway that rose a few hundred feet above the storage unit. It could serve some useful purpose as a sniper hideout or, at the very least, an OP to call in an airstrike if he and Tim were lucky enough to have a plane or drone allocated to them for an afternoon. One thing was for sure, they weren't blowing up an entire storage facility. First off, they didn't have enough explosives, and second, the building was tantamount to a small fortress and would need to be addressed with a different approach. He knew they'd ask for an airstrike and probably be denied due to the lack of resources, but he'd try all the same. If an airstrike was not an option, Mike knew they would be required to come up with an inventive way to rid Petaluma of the North Koreans before they were able to establish secure passage for a mechanized invasion. Tim entered the break room and sank into a hard plastic chair. "So, what's the deal?" Mike looked up from the map. His tightly pressed lips told Tim the deal was full of crummy options. "I need you to ask for air support. They're going to deny it, I know. After that, we've got to figure out a way to kill these dudes, and it ain't going to be done with a raid." "I'll make the request in an hour when I check in," Tim confirmed. "See if they can drop equipment. We may need a Mark 22 for some long-range stuff." Tim rolled his eyes. "I'll ask, but there's no way a helo is flying a single rifle out here to us." "I know," Mike groaned, realizing reluctantly that their radio calls were little more than Christmas wish lists that would probably all be denied. Darian cleared his throat to get Mike's attention. There's a gun store over on Lakeville Street. We know the guy who owns it. He's got stuff in there that can get out past 1,000 yards. Let's see what Tim can come up with, and then maybe we'll go talk to your guy." Mike exhaled hard as an increasing pressure made its presence known. He felt as though he was participating from a position of disadvantage in this war. Green Beret missions were calculated risks, no doubt about that, and oftentimes Green Berets found themselves without the air cover most U.S. troops came to rely on. Their situation now was different and made him appreciate the hardships of his former foes who'd fought America with 50-year-old rifles and explosives scavenged from discarded munitions. As he held a hand out to Tim, he reminded himself that he didn't have to like it, he just had to do it. "Give me your personal radio. I'm going to have these two sit on an OP and report out on the storage facility. We can monitor from here while we come up with a game plan." Begrudgingly, Tim removed his radio and slid it across the table. Quickly, Mike gave the Bayet brothers a crash course on how to use it, going through the basic functions of the radio, how to turn it on, and how to push the buttons to transmit. They wouldn't be changing channels or doing any of the countless functions the complicated radios were capable of. When he finished, he handed the radio to Darian, noting Rostam's dismay. "Keep it off until you're in place here," Mike instructed, pointing to a spot across the highway from the storage facility, high on the side of a hill 100 feet in elevation. "Get to the top of these hills and find a spot where you can watch the entire storage place. The backside is this golf course. If something happens, just haul your asses down the backside of this hill, across the golf course, and disappear into the neighborhood." Both brothers sat forward, their attention bouncing back and forth between points on the map Mike pointed out and Mike himself, both dead serious as they listened to his instructions. Even Rostam took it all in quietly. "Report in once you've found a place to set up, and then I'll check in every hour on the hour. Otherwise, keep the radio off to conserve the battery." "What if they leave between radio check-ins?" Rostam asked, unable to stay quiet any longer. "Call in any time if there's something we should know about." He removed his watch and then dug out his binoculars. "Take these, and Tim will give you a spotting scope." "I will?" Tim's face conveyed his opposition to giving away yet another piece of valuable gear. "You will," Mike said flatly.